Hello everyone, thank you for joining this session. Thank you for choosing to watch this talk. Before I start, I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to speak to you here. I'm really grateful to be able to speak alongside these amazing people I look up to, and I hope you'll find something useful and interesting in my talk to take away. I'll try to answer your questions in the conference chat, so feel free to ask anything you might be interested in. And what I'll be talking about today is API documentation. Now, the thing about documentation is that people like to talk and complain about it, but nobody likes to write it. But at the same time, everybody wants to have good documentation. And I think that's great that people care about documentation and want to talk about it because it helps us technical writers, it helps us get the visibility and gives us opportunities like this one, like this, to speak at this conference, to talk about the work that we do and help others understand the importance of our work. So, as I said, I'll be talking about API documentation, but more specifically, we'll focus on 5 thoughts, suggestions, ideas that you might want to implement if you want to take your documentation from just average to amazing. Because I work as a technical writer, coincidentally at Redocly, where we're all about API documentation tools, I will be talking from a technical writer's perspective, focusing on things that technical writers can do to improve their documentation. This inevitably includes the user's perspective as well, because as technical writers, we practice user empathy at every step, and we try to think of the user's best interests. So speaking of best interests, it's in the best interest of every business and organization dealing with APIs to invest in improving their API documentation. Because without the documentation, how can you sell your API? Who will use it and how? The documentation has become the standard part of the API product, and in a way, the docs are the graphical interface of your API. And for many people, they are the very first touch point with your API. The documentation is part of the API discovery of the developer journey, and it's really in your best interest as a business to have API documentation that stands out. Now, these reports and graphs and quotes that I'm showing are proof that I'm not making this up. You can see in this market research and in these reports on the state of the API industry that come out every year, just how many people care about documentation, and for how many of them it's the driving factor in deciding whether to use or integrate an API. These percentages always surprise me a little bit because I honestly don't expect them to be this high. And of course, all this places high expectations on the docs and consequently on the people who create and maintain them. Because if we know that people care so much about documentation, obviously we will want to improve it, or maybe even feel pressured to improve it. But how do we know what makes amazing documentation? And how will we know that we've made it? We did it. Our documentation is no longer average, it's now amazing. When does this happen? So when you ask people for examples of great API documentation, a lot of people say Stripe, a lot of people say Twilio, and they're right, those examples are great. But have you stopped to think, what is it about that documentation that makes it so great? And how did they get there? You might say that amazing documentation has everything a user might need. And with that, you're getting close to the point. Because over time, many different types of content become sort of must-have or part of the standard equipment of the API documentation. I'm thinking things like sandboxes, SDKs, authentication guides, code examples, obviously, pagination guides, postman collections. And as time goes on, this list just grows. But the thing is, it's not you as the documentation creator who gets to set the standard for what great documentation is. It's your audience. Their expectations and needs drive the standard and continuously raise the bar for what it means to have great documentation. I believe that great documentation is the kind of documentation that never leaves the user hanging. It never breaks their workflow by having them stop and wonder, how do I find this thing I need? So for me, great documentation is able to intercept or anticipate the user's needs and meet them there before they even think about it. So it's not so much about having all these different types of content, but also about how you present and integrate them into a documentation experience. Your docs could have a bunch of tutorials on every single aspect of your APIs, but if this information is poorly organized, the users won't get the value they need from it. So creating and maintaining documentation is almost like a never-ending process of making decisions, of making choices and weighing them against each other to see which ones bring the most value to the users. And when thinking about these changes, these choices, these decisions, I'd like you to apply the mindset of a restaurant menu, if that makes sense. Instead of seeing the choices as something you make once and never go back. Because when you come to a restaurant, you can order just one thing or many things at once. You can come back and try something else later, try different combinations of meals. It's not like you come to a restaurant, order a pizza, and then they tell you you can't order salad anymore because you've chosen pizza and eliminated salads. So the same goes for these documentation improvements that I'm going to suggest in this talk. You don't have to apply all of them or all of them at once. It's more about experimenting, iterating, finding what works for you and your audience. And if you try something and realize it doesn't work, that's not a failure, that's an experience you can learn from and implement new changes based on that. So let's start with the first choice you could make. You could add more trust signals to your documentation. This is a very common complaint among users. They don't know when your docs have been updated, and they don't know if they can trust the information that's in there. If the user tries one code sample and it doesn't work, then tries another and that doesn't work either, how do you think they feel about your API? Let's run with that restaurant menu analogy that I mentioned before. Let's just lean into it. If you come to a restaurant and order something from the menu and the waiter tells you, oh, we don't have it today, so you order something else, they don't have that either. It doesn't sound like a very fun place to eat, right? So trust signals like these are about communicating a bit more than usual, like going a little above and beyond with your communication to inject a bit more of that value into the documentation. Because when you start doing this, you're directly responding to users' needs and accommodating them, and users will appreciate that. Another choice worth making is investing in accessibility of your documentation. This means accommodating different needs and making your documentation more flexible, more adaptable to different workflows. It also makes the documentation more dynamic and contributes to creating this feeling of a personalized, tailored experience. Because you give users control to change the layout, to change the appearance of the documentation by changing the colors and fonts. You let them use their own example values everywhere. You let them take the documentation with them anywhere, on the phone or in a portable format. It makes people feel like the documentation is this tool that works for them, a tool that is considerate of their needs. And this very nicely ties into this next idea of catering to different types of users by providing content variety. Again, it's all about creating a tailored contextual experience. So instead of distracting users with a list of all languages and libraries you support at the top of every article, let them choose just one language and then show only content relevant to that. You can also try creating best practices guides, but make them specific, make them focused on a particular aspect of your API usage. For example, how to optimize their usage if you have rate limiting, or how to improve performance when working with large data sets. On the other side, you also want to have content for people who are new to this whole API thing and who need to understand how to work with an API. So you will want to help them with setting up an environment in which they can interact with your API. You could also create content that helps people understand the difference between the products you offer and how these products complement each other. This type of content is useful not just to developers, but to people who make business decisions. And this is why you want to have content variety, to help different kinds of users, because you never know who might be calling the shots on whether to use your API. And you want the documentation to feel welcoming, inclusive, and useful to everyone. And this previous point about showing how products complement each other again ties into the next idea or the next decision that you could make, which is really seriously focus on your content organization and information architecture. This is especially important for projects that have a lot of APIs, a lot of endpoints, and potentially huge sets of documentation. You must help your users navigate all this. So it's a good idea to provide links to next steps and related resources. This is again all about intercepting, anticipating what the user might want to do next and setting it all up for them. Similarly, you will want to tell your users at the beginning of every guide or tutorial what's going to be covered in it so that they know what to expect. This way they can quickly decide if this content is something they need right now, so you just save them some time. Now, with large projects, you may have docs hosted in different places, maybe use different tools to build all this variety of documentation, but try to make them look the same. It feels really distracting when a link from the docs leads to something that looks completely different, but it's also part of the same documentation. It's sort of a negative trust signal, and it risks breaking the workflow because the user will stop to wonder what kind of site this is, where they are now, right? The point of investing in better information architecture and content organization is to make sure your documentation never makes users feel like they're lost. And the last choice you could make is to be more transparent and open in your documentation. If at all possible, do not lock your API documentation behind a login. How are people going to discover your APIs that way? It's like going to buy an ice cream and you having to pay to see all the flavors they offer. Similarly, if you have a lot of APIs, a lot of endpoints, and even if you don't, you should index all of them in one place in the documentation. This can be just like a simple index or a full API catalog, but either way, it will help your user explore what you offer more independently. And finally, don't keep the restrictions secret. Tell people what they can and can't do with your APIs. The users will appreciate it more if you tell them about edge cases and restrictions in the documentation than if they have to discover them on their own in production. So yeah, those were all the decisions that I suggest you consider for improving your API documentation. So this slide is essentially just a summary of everything I've just said. So if you haven't been paying attention and you just woke up, you can just screenshot this and you're good to go. But on a serious note though, if you decide to evolve your documentation from average to amazing, it won't be easy and it won't happen overnight. That much is obvious. It may take resources that you don't yet have, and you will have to prioritize things ruthlessly. And some specific challenges that will come up are, okay, we need to anticipate the needs of our audience, but how do we know who our audience is, right? Or you may want to implement an accessibility improvement, but your documentation tools don't support it. So to make sure you succeed and overcome these kinds of challenges, you need to set yourself up for success and do some research. So that's not just audience research, it's also tooling research, testing, exploring what's available out there. And it's also great advice for technical writers to collaborate with developers. Just get them on board, ask them for help with implementing specific improvements to the API documentation. Their own experience as documentation users can also be incredibly valuable, so you can interview them too as part of your audience research. It's really important that technical writers are not the only people who care about API documentation in an organization. So if you can get to that level, then you're already amazing. And then the only thing left is to make sure your documentation is amazing and that your API consumers can enjoy while consuming it. Yeah, that didn't work as a pun, did it? Anyway, thank you so much for listening, and let's keep talking about the docs in the chat, or you can message me on Twitter anytime. My handle is down there on the slide. Thank you.